Hello, and welcome to another episode of Rational Actors on Blogging Heads. I'm Kevin Glass, managing editor of Town Hall, and today I'm joined by
Rebecca Nelson. I'm a staff correspondent at National Journal.
Thanks for coming on with me, Rebecca. What caught my attention is a piece you did a couple weeks ago on the phenomenon of politician slash potential presidential candidate books and book tours. And I think it's a really interesting way of reading the tea leaves about who on the national level is getting ready to make a presidential run. But I also think there's something interesting in why some of these people are releasing books, and if their kind of semi-forays into the presidential field are nothing more than glorified book tours. So I wanted to kind of ask you about what went into that piece. What are your thoughts on some of the candidates who both have released books and have books coming out soon, and what that means for the 2016 elections?
Yeah, definitely. Well, as you know, politicians, it's sort of a rite of passage to release a book before you run for president. So we have a number of politicians who have already written books in the past, like Marco Rubio. He released a memoir a few years ago. Ben Carson is a prolific author. But then Ted Cruz has never written a book. So clearly someone told Ted Cruz, you're interested in running for the presidency, so you should probably release a book. So I guess that is really interesting to look at, whether there are two different camps, it seems. The one you mentioned, the sort of glorified book tour, which I suppose we can kind of lump Ben Carson, Carly Fiorina into that, and then also which politicians are using these books as a springboard for a campaign, how they can, use these books, use these tombs to shape their narrative.
Yeah, and Ben Carson, I think, is an interesting test case because he's not a typical politician. You might say that he kind of came to prominence first as an author, and is, if you look at historical sales or sales of their entire catalog, if you count him in the politicians category, he's one of the best-selling political authors of all time, in the top 15, I think. So yeah, he's just released a book, and that's not all that out of the ordinary for him, because again, he's a fairly prolific author in his own right.
Right.
But I would wonder if it is kind of a way to both semi-explore a presidential run and use it as a platform to sell some more of his books.
Definitely. I mean, and I think it's a little of both, because his book, it struck me as sort of the chicken soup for the teenage soul variety. It's Think Big, the teen's guide to thinking big, which is his philosophy that he debuted in an earlier book in the 90s. It's like integrity, being nice, being honest. It's the acronym Think Big. And so it's definitely a way for him to sell more books, because he is already a prolific author, as you said. I think he would have released this book no matter what. But this also gives him an opportunity to talk about his childhood. He talks about growing up in inner city Detroit with an overworked mother and a father who abandoned his family. So it's also a way to kind of set this narrative of how he really lived the American dream and came from nothing and has become this renowned neurosurgeon. But it's not an overtly political book. It's sort of like an advice book to teens. So it kind of functions as both of those, in both of those spaces.
Yeah, I'd say some of these politicians slash political books kind of fall into one of two categories. They're either, as I haven't read Carson's book, but you just described it as more autobiographical, kind of talking about their life experiences, and if we wanted to put it in a political context, kind of introducing their quote-unquote story to the American people in a very long form, obviously, but something that you can kind of condense, if you wanted to, into a stump speech, about how someone grows up, what their family's like, and how that informs their worldview. But I would contrast that with books that are a little more explicitly political, that address kind of big picture problems that a politician identifies, in America. And not that the books are really, really intricate policy tracks, but they are more prescriptive when it comes to government policy, federal policy, and politics in general. And usually those, there are elements of autobiography. It might be, I grew up in this kind of a household. We used this federal program. It was inefficient in this way, and here's how to reform it, and things like that. But I would kind of separate those two into those two different categories. And coming up this year, we're going to see, I think, I don't know what to expect from Ted Cruz, for example. Like you said, he's never written a book. But I'd expect from presidential candidates more of the latter, kind of semi-political tracts from people like Jeb Bush, people like Rand Paul, that would be closer to a pseudo-campaign platform.
Definitely, and a really good example of that is Marco Rubio's book that came out earlier this year. It's American Dreams, Economic Opportunity for Everyone. And it's really focused, it's really heavy into policy, talking about the economic policies that he would like to implement to really lift the middle class up. He does, as you said, he uses his own personal background. He always talks about, how his father was a bartender and his mother was a maid, and how they were able to lift themselves into the middle class. And his whole sort of stump speech that has started on this book tour is that that's no longer possible, and that he wants to, here are his policy prescriptions to fix that. And he also goes really deep into foreign policy as well in this book. And he's sort of fashioned himself as a really a scholarly, like, foreign policy hawk. He is on the Foreign Relations Committee, so he's kind of positioning himself in the space of he knows what he's talking about on foreign policy, and he goes into that in the book. So that is a really good example. His book is a really good example of actually getting deep into the policy as a sort of campaign preview.
His transformation is interesting because he rose to prominence on, I won't say the back of, but with a lot of Tea Party grassroots support that I think was motivated way more by anti-Charlie Crist bias than pro-Rubio sentiment. And he has kind of, like you said, fashioned himself into someone more, I don't want to say quote unquote more serious, but someone who has fit well into the policymaking world of Washington D.C., who isn't as prone to very media-friendly outbursts or something like that, and someone who takes a lot of flack on the right now for some of his actual policy prescriptions, specifically on immigration. So that's an interesting thing to look forward to, I guess, to him semi on the campaign trail. He hasn't been making as much noise or as many moves as some of the other potential presidential candidates, but I think he's definitely there, and specifically with the kind of book that you described, someone who can move forward with a potential presidential run.
Right. I mean, he hasn't been, like you said, he hasn't been as making as much noise in the pre-campaign season, but he's been studying. He's been doing his homework. He has been really making himself, really learning about the different policies that he wants to push and the different issues that are going to be big in 2016. And I think he's going to be sort of maybe not a dark horse, but people are going to be surprised by how much he can run circles around other 2016ers.
Yeah, I don't want to discount the potency of someone like Ben Carson, but for a non-politician like that, I would just say I'll believe it when I see it if he's actually up on a debate stage at any point. Although, you look at the strength of then the passion of some of his supporters, and it's hard to say, to completely rule that out, to say that he's using a potential 2016 run as a glorified book tour. So that'll be really interesting to see if someone like that actually makes that run and becomes, the complete non-politician Herman Cain or, late period, I would say, Newt Gingrich of 2016.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I don't think it's fair to kind of lump him in the same category of a Donald Trump, but I mean, he kind of comes from a similar space, but he also does something for the GOP that they're really lacking, and that's, he's truly a regular person. I mean, like I said, he came from nothing and has built himself up, truly living the American dream. And that's something, I mean, being able to talk to real Americans, your Joe the plumber types, I mean, that is going to be a big strength of his. So, but definitely, we have a lot more to wait for and wait around and see on him.
What I'm also interested in is, to a certain extent, these books are kind of, at least for the books that aren't expected to particularly sell well. So that might be Marco Rubio's book, for example. That might be Jeb Bush's upcoming book. Those, to me, it strikes as almost a down payment on future sales. Because right now, the most not prolific, the highest selling politician author is Barack Obama. And that wasn't the case before he became president. So to a certain extent, some of these quote-unquote policy books, these political tracts, they're not necessarily made to sell copies. They're not even necessarily made to make money for the people who are writing them, although I'm fairly certain, and I don't know if you know any more information on this, I'm fairly certain their advances are not terrible. Rick Santorum's book, for example, that came out last year, also a kind of down payment on maybe we'll get more sales if he becomes a legit 2016 contender. Because a lot of those books, and BuzzFeed wrote a piece on this last year, a lot of those politician books, they straight up don't sell well. And a lot of the conservative movement made fun of, for example, Hillary Clinton's book, her last book that came out, in which she got a massive, massive advance. I think the largest advance for a politician author in history, and it sold terribly. And conservatives were making fun of this. But to a certain extent, it's not about sales. It seems to me, like I said, a down payment on future sales. Because if Hillary Clinton becomes president in 2016, people are going to buy that book.
Right. And I mean, I think for most of these politicians, they're not doing this to, to fund another yacht or anything. I mean, it truly is political strategy. And maybe a lot of regular Americans and regular voters aren't going to read their books. Maybe their book sales aren't great, but if they have a book, we in the media will be talking about it, and they'll get publicity from that, and that's a way for them to sort of sell their campaign narrative. So I mean, I don't want to say book sales don't matter at all, because obviously they do. You want voters to be reading what politicians or their ghostwriters are writing, but it's more. I mean, it's more about the whole sort of lens that the book or the presentation that the book offers of this politician.
I also wonder, and maybe you have more insight on this, if the book is an excuse to go around the country kind of promoting their book, but also, bringing their large political team with them, potentially meeting with donors. And if someone asks, they say, no, I'm just on my book tour. I was just in Colorado or Iowa or South Carolina promoting my book. I wasn't there doing any, campaigning, doing any donor meetings or anything like that. So I wonder, and like I said, you've been covering a couple of these events, and I wonder if the book is kind of a way to have a semi-campaign around the country without actually having a campaign around the country.
Oh, completely. You're right on. I mean, Marco Rubio has been on his book tour all over the country over the past few weeks, and it's an opportunity for him to get press, to talk to voters. And I mean, yes, it's about his book, but his book has all of the things that he would do as president. So it's a stump speech basically guised as a book tour. Um, Huckabee is I think he's on his book tour now, is doing the same thing. I mean, as, branding himself as this sort of culture warrior. I don't know if you have seen the reports about his book, but he like name checks Miley Cyrus, Beyonce, like
Yeah,
all of these
yeah.
pop culture figures. And that is an opportunity for him to do these media tours, do these media interviews, and spread his message that he is a social conservative. So definitely, it's an opportunity for them to kind of get away with campaigning before the campaign even starts.
Yeah, that was, and I want to say, a lot of these books, they rarely make news. They're generally as, focus grouped as a stump speech. But that Huckabee's book was, I would say, a rare exception to that. Because, like you said, he had the pop culture comments. He kind of said he didn't believe the Beyonce Jay-Z relationship was a family model for Americans to aspire to, which caught him a lot of flack in the press and even in the conservative movement for saying, that's what seems to be, at least even to conservatives, a fairly conventional nuclear family. That's not something that's desirable in America right now. So yeah, I would say certainly it's a way for them to get their message out there, to even to establish relationships with the necessary press. If you go to Iowa, you might have a meeting with a reporter or two from the Des Moines Register on your book and say, I'm just here for my book tour, when you actually want the Des Moines Register to be covering that you're there and here's your message and here's your book and here's what your book says about what you would do for America and all of that.
Completely, yeah. And I mean, I was at an event a couple of weeks ago with Rubio, and it was ostensibly for, I think, a stop on his book tour. But I mean, they opened it up to the media to ask questions, and it was an opportunity for us to hear more about 2016. So that's definitely the case. But Huckabee, that was such an interesting. I loved his comments about Beyonce, and like that the fact that he even wrote the word twerking was hilarious to me.
Right. What was it in his book that he made the comments about women in the North versus women in the South and swearing, or was that on his show or on a radio show or something like that?
That I'm not sure about. I didn't hear about that, but that wouldn't surprise me at all.
But he has certainly been making waves as kind of proto-culture warrior, the
Definitely.
proto-culture warrior in the race, even more so than Rick Santorum,
Right.
who has surprisingly shied away from some of the cultural issues.
Yeah, he's definitely like making sure that he is the premier culture warrior in 2016. When Santorum seemed to be vying for a similar space in that social conservative realm, but I think Huckabee's sort of, like you said, being able to make news about your political book. It seems like a good strategy for him to actually connect with voters on things they know about, things they watch on TV, like The Bachelorette or whatever, Lady Gaga. And
Right.
so it's a way for them to actually connect with him on these conservative values.
Right. I wonder if I don't know what message plays better to a national audience, but it's certainly, it seems like Huckabee is actually knows what pop culture is, he just hates it, versus just not knowing what pop culture is at all, which is, I think, the basis of a lot of Republicans, and probably Rick Santorum. I don't know if Rick Santorum has any opinions on Beyonce, for example. But what I wonder, and maybe you obviously have read more of these books than I have. Michael Tomasky had a piece in the Daily Beast today lamenting, I think, what he considered to be the vapidity of some of these books. And in my opinion, an ideal book in this kind of situation would be more like Marco Rubio's book and less like Mike Huckabee's book, in that you just want to get an extended sort of space to put down what your beliefs are and what you want to push for, but also in a vague enough way that it's not going to ruffle any feathers or make any waves, rather than the Huckabee book, which got a lot of attention for potentially negative reasons. They say all press is good press. I don't think that's necessarily the case when it comes to running a campaign. But I wonder if you think that some of these books are supposed to make a message, or if they're supposed to just kind of be something that they can hold up and say, this is what I believe in, and leave it at that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, for example, Carly Fiorina's book that is coming out in, I think, May, is probably, I mean, I haven't read it, I haven't seen a review copy, but that's probably going to be more on the vapid end of things. I mean, she's talking about, I think it's called, like, taking a stand or something about the challenges she's been through. And it's very vaguely talking about, these are self-inflicted wounds and we need to go back to conservative values. So, I mean, yes, maybe a message that if she were to ever run, she would run on, but does not have, I doubt that it will have any specific policy prescriptions. But that being said, I don't think it's necessary or it's detrimental to a politician to, go that different route than Rubio has. I mean, I think it's all about, again, how you are branding yourself in this book. So Jeb Bush, for example, he has an ebook coming out sometime early this year. And he has only said that it will be sort of a reflection on his time in the governor's mansion. But we can assume that a lot of that will also be recasting himself or reintroducing himself to a new generation of Republican voters. I mean, he's been out of office since 2007. So this is an opportunity for him to, say, this is who I am and this is what I stand for. And I don't think it necessarily has to be really specific policy goals or proposals in that case.
Yeah, Fiorina's book, I think, is a really interesting test case, because she's someone who, on her biography, would seem to be closer to Ben Carson than some of the other candidates. She's never held political office. She's I guess, former businesswoman is her largest accomplishment. She worked for Hewlett Packard, right?
She was the CEO of Hewlett Packard.
Yeah, exactly. But she seems to genuinely, and this is just my prognosticating here and just reading the tea leaves, she seems to genuinely want to run for president despite not having held political office, which, is a perfectly fine ambition, but it would put her book, I suppose, closer to the Marco, like you said, the Marco Rubio end of the spectrum, rather than using the opportunity to dip her toe in the presidential waters as an excuse to sell some books and to make a name for herself and, possibly just in general raise her profile.
Right. I mean, I think her profile is pretty high as far as these sort of politicians or hopeful politicians go. I mean, it was a huge news story in 2005 when she was fired from Hewlett Packard, and she wrote a memoir, Tough Choices. That was before Hillary Clinton's book, Hard Choices. So she wrote Tough Choices. That was this memoir on, her rise and fall, basically. So she's already sort of done that. This is the book that will, actually sort of sell, I think. I mean, that to me sounds like a much more interesting book, to be honest. Some more drama in that. But so this to me, her new book, and it's called Rising to the Challenge, My Leadership Journey. So it's a lot more, I think, probably focused on what, kind of explaining her leadership abilities and her background in making the case for a Fiorina presidency. Whether that is at all likely, that's up for debate, but I think that's
Right.
probably her strategy.
Yeah, I mean, it could be both. She could be genuinely trying to run for president and also raising her profile at the same time. I mean, Mike Huckabee made a very serious run for president in 2008 and got a Fox News show out of it, which is not a bad kind of consolation prize. So, that might be, again, something that she's trying to work on creating a persona around herself in addition to actually wanting to be president of the United States. I wanted to ask you on the other side of the aisle. I mean, we know Hillary Clinton has written books. She just wrote one that came out last year. Do you know, are there any Democrats who are planning books that are looking to come out anytime soon? Because, I mean, I consider myself a fairly plugged-in political person, and it really seems like it's getting late for a serious contender to arrive to compete with Hillary Clinton for the Democratic nomination.
Right. Well, that's, I think, a problem for the Democrats across the board. But no, I was really struck when I was writing this piece because I kept thinking there has to be a Democrat who is coming out with a book. And really the only thing that I could find was Martin O'Malley had hinted that he might write a book. And so when you're at that point on the Democratic end of things, that's pretty dire because there are, I mean, I don't know how many possible Democratic candidates have written books. I mean, I think Bernie Sanders has written a book. I think Elizabeth Warren. But, I mean, it makes a lot more sense, as we've seen on the Republican side, for these politicians to actually put something out at least this year, that would kind of explain and bolster a campaign. And that's just not happening, except for Hillary Clinton's book.
That's interesting. I didn't know about Martin O'Malley coming out with a book. He has always been kind of mentioned as someone who has a future in higher level politics, but has always struck me as someone who is really, really terrible on the stump, like the Tim Pawlenty of the Democratic Party. So I never got the enthusiasm for Martin O'Malley, but I guess he might be testing the waters, like you said. I have no idea who's even going to be on a debate stage with Hillary Clinton at this point.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I think all of us in the political world are wondering. I mean, there has to be someone with a higher profile than Bernie Sanders who is definitely going to be running, but would she want to share a debate stage with him with just Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders? I'm not sure. So I think someone like a Martin O'Malley who has, can command respect within the Democratic field, she would want to share that debate space with him. But I mean, he is one of the sort of saddest candidates on the Democratic side. I mean, he just is competing for a lot of a similar base that Hillary Clinton is. So it's going to be tough for him.
Yeah, maybe Dennis Kucinich will make another run as the Ron Paul of the Democratic Party, and it'll just be him and Hillary debating.
Yeah, I can only hope for another exciting candidate like that, just for my own personal covering 2016. That would be fun.
Yeah. So I wanted to get to, and this is kind of tangentially related, the recent kind of Koch forum meeting that was held by the Koch. I don't know if it was the company or the institute, but major Republicans went there, and you covered that. And I wanted to get your impression on kind of where everything stands coming out of that meeting.
Yeah, so that whole summit, which was last weekend in California, it was put on by Freedom Partners, which is a subsidiary of Koch Industries. There was only one panel of the whole weekend-long summit that was available. It was closed press, but it was live streamed. And that was Sunday night, and it was Rubio, Ted Cruz, and Rand Paul, which was a really interesting. It was really interesting to see them all on the same stage and just kind of like just talking about what they believed and interacting with each other. What my sort of my impression of that was Cruz was really trying hard to pander to these mega donors, and I think there were like 300 people at that panel, and Rubio was really prepared. I mean, he had his he knew his stuff. He had his points really down pat, and Paul was just really kind of nonchalant, and he seemed to not understand or care about the importance of this kind of a Koch primary, as some people were calling it. And he kind of showed his true colors as he's wont to do. But in this, hugely influential audience of these huge donors, I mean, he didn't seem to, not that he should pander to them, but he did not even seem at all eager for their approval. I mean, they talked everything from Cuba to Iran to defense spending, and on all three of those points, Paul significantly differed from Rubio and Cruz. I mean, on Cuba, he was basically saying, and especially having Cruz and Rubio, whose parents both came from Cuba, he kind of countered their points, saying, we don't agree with Obama's shift in policy. And he was saying, maybe we'll see, we've been doing this for 50 years, maybe it'll change. And it was sort of like a shrug, like, this is what I think. I don't really care what you guys think about that. Which to me did not seem like the best way to approach such an important event like this, such an important opportunity to share, to present yourself to these Republican donors.
Interesting. I mean, he might subscribe to the theory that I generally subscribe to, which is that money doesn't win elections. And so he doesn't necessarily need to pander to the donors. But that's interesting. What I'm excited for is the Conservative Political Action Conference at the end of February, so in a couple weeks now, which is going to have basically all the big names. They just announced Jeb Bush, which I think this will be the highest profile event since he I don't remember the wording that he used, since he said, I'm seriously considering forming an exploratory committee, but it'll be kind of the highest profile event that he's done since that. And so I'm interested to see how everyone is received, because for some, Rand Paul plays well with a certain segment of the conservative base, plays very poorly with a certain other segment. Jeb Bush doesn't seem to play well with any of the conservative base, but does seem to have a lot of the donor interest on his side. So I want to see kind of where the candidates end up in about early to mid-March, and who I think that the field will kind of really be coalescing around then.
Definitely. And I think another thing that will be really interesting about CPAC is this year, instead of just letting these candidates give their rote stump speech, they're going to be asked to talk about specific policy issues. And on top of that, they will be fielding audience questions, which I think will be, I'm wondering why they would open up these candidates to that, because it could get messy. But I think it'll be really interesting to see, to really test these candidates out and see how they do in not only roomfuls of media, but roomfuls of, really influential conservative voters, and how their off-the-cuff answers go over.
Yeah. All right, I think that's about all we have for today. Thanks a lot for joining me today.
Great, thanks so much for having me.
And I'm really interested in the book stuff, and I guess we'll see where it goes from here and how the field looks in about a month or so.
Yeah, it'll definitely be exciting to watch.
All right, thanks a lot, Rebecca.
Thank you.